Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world, the war in Vietnam. I would like to answer some of the questions that I know are on the minds of many of you listening to me.
In 1975, the capital of South Vietnam was captured by communist forces, and the government of South Vietnam surrendered.
Ông đại tá nói các anh về cái từ Yên Chí sản xuất, tôi chặn Việt Cộng rồi nó không vô được đâu, không vô Sài Gòn được đâu. Tới ngày 30 tháng 4 Việt Cộng chiếm vô thành phố luôn, chiếm Sài Gòn. Ông ngoại tin rằng chắc là Việt Cộng đánh không thắng thì Việt Nam đâu, vì Mỹ sẽ giúp. Cuối cùng ông ngoại đào cái hầm ở đằng sau nhà cho ông ngoại và 9 đứa con. Cái hầm vừa đào xong thì ông Dương Văn Minh tổng thống kêu ra lệnh đầu hàng. Đào hầm vừa xong là đầu hàng rồi thì ông ngoại buông cái cuốc xuống, ông ngoại khóc.
Although the fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War, for many of the South Vietnamese it was only the start of a long journey that would ultimately lead them to America. Within 18 hours, U.S. military forces carried out a mass evacuation effort to transport over 1,000 American civilians and nearly 7,000 South Vietnamese refugees out of Saigon.
I immigrated to the United States in 1975 when I was 12 years old. In fact, I had no idea that my family was actually leaving Vietnam permanently, or that we would eventually settle in the United States. I remember while we were in line to get on a U.S. Air Force cargo plane, it was pretty tumultuous, but I noticed the woman who owned a rental bookshop in my neighborhood. And I remember worrying that she might recognize me and that she might remember that I owed some overdue books.
During the spring of 1975, 125,000 people left South Vietnam. They stayed at reception camps in the Philippines and Guam before being transferred to temporary housing at U.S. military bases.
From Vietnam, we flew to the island of Guam, where there was a refugee camp set up for the South Vietnamese. And from there, we eventually went to a camp on a military base in the state of Arkansas.
Although South Vietnamese immigration was initially met with resentment by Americans, the U.S. government stated that it had a moral obligation to the refugees.
We're a country built by immigrants.
In 1975, President Ford passed the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, which allowed Vietnamese refugees to enter the United States under a special status and allocated $405 million in resettlement aid. From 1978 to the mid-1980s, political and economic instability under the new communist regime prompted a second wave of migration. Many former military officers and government officials from South Vietnam were sent to so-called re-education camps, where many inmates suffered torture, starvation, and disease while being forced into hard labor.
My father was a colonel in the South Vietnamese Air Force. So if he had stayed in Vietnam, he would have been put in a concentration camp, if not executed. And his family would have lost everything. In fact, my father's older brother, who was just a medical doctor in the South Vietnamese army, did not escape in time, and he spent about 10 years in a concentration camp after the fall of the South Vietnamese Republic.
Họ nói ông ngoại là sĩ quan, ông bắt ngoại đi học tập cải tạo. Thì lúc đó ông ngoại cũng có là tính đi vượt biên theo tụi nó, thì ông ngoại bị bắt. Ở tù trong Việt Cộng 6 tháng vì tội vượt biên, nghĩa là đi nước ngoài bất hợp pháp đó.
After the institution of food rations, famine grew widespread across the country, and businesses were nationalized by the communist regime.
Mỗi người một tháng được 7 kg gạo, lương thực, mỗi một tháng được nửa kilo thịt, Mình có bao nhiêu tiền là cũng cho đổi mình được 200 đồng của Việt Nam thôi. Bao nhiêu tiền là bỏ hết. Chế độ ông ngoại có con mới sanh nó 1 tháng nó phát được 1 hộp sữa.
To escape these conditions, over 800,000 South Vietnamese people fled on small, crowded fishing boats between 1975 and 1995. Survivors were found by foreign ships and brought to asylum camps in neighboring Southeast Asian countries, but others endured storms, starvation, and piracy.
I was younger. I remember I left on a boat. The boat is about 10 feet long. 2 days, after we left, we ran into a big storm in the Pacific Ocean. I remember it was pitch black. It was really dark. There's no light, and then we survived the storm. And the next day, we met a Thai fishing ship, the Dash Pirate. So they picked us up, they fed us, and then they did some bad thing with the women in the boat. And we make it to Thailand, a refugee camp, and we stayed there for almost 2 years. We got to America in '89.
Many of these boat people didn't reach their destinations during their search for freedom. A large portion of those who attempted to flee from the totalitarian regime died or disappeared. In fact, the plight of the boat people compelled the US to pass the Refugee Act of 1980 under President Carter, which eased restrictions on the entry of Vietnamese refugees. Between 1978 and 1982, over 280,000 Vietnamese refugees were admitted. Vietnamese immigration again spiked in 1992, when many re-education camp inmates were released and sponsored by their families to move to America. Eventually, by the turn of the 21st century, most Vietnamese immigrants were not refugees. Instead, they were migrants sponsored by their relatives in America.
Sau đó con tôi đã học hành thành tài, và cậu con tên là Võ Bảo đã lãnh cho vợ chồng tôi qua Mỹ. Tháng 6 2001, chúng tôi được đến Mỹ đoàn tụ các con tôi.
Ultimately, although these refugees initially faced numerous obstacles, such as the language barrier and racial discrimination, they worked hard to overcome these difficulties, to adapt, and to make a home for themselves in America.
I have worked at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona for 23 years now as a neuroscientist and a professor in neuroscience.
Và cuộc sống đối với mẹ thì ở nước Mỹ rất là giống một thiên đường. Nhưng ở Việt Nam chắc bây giờ ông ngoại cũng không còn sống tới giờ đâu.